Hey, and welcome to the Daily Objective brought to you by the Ayn Rand Center UK, where we talk about all current events and all things out there that affect you from an objectivist point of view. Today, my co-host is Nicolas Krusek. You've seen us together on this show before. I'm on the road, so I'm not home in Los Angeles. I'm not in Pittsburgh, where I was working. I am now in Albuquerque, New Mexico, extremely exhausted, driving home west, but making time for this awesome show that I love to do. And today we're going to be talking about the trends that seem to be happening in our youth. They seem to be gathering a force of people through social media, gathering onto the streets and committing acts of vandalism and violence. This happened last weekend in Chicago and in Compton, where they have these things called street takeovers, where street racers, race up and down the street, do donuts, and then the 500 or 600 or so people who are watching the event then storm a store, take it over, steal all of its stuff, assault anybody who gets in their way, and then leave. The police in both these cases, in both the teen trends going on in Chicago and Los Angeles, cannot do anything because they're outnumbered. And the recent defund the police issues within the political class have created a shortage of personnel. So they can't take care of these folks when this stuff is happening. So here to discuss this issue with me is Nicolas. And Nicolas, did you hear about this stuff that went on in Chicago and Compton?
Well, I've done a little bit of research since you proposed the topic yesterday. The Canadian media has been conspicuously silent on what's been going on south of the border. But as I've been reading some articles on the subject and watching some news clips, the first thing that popped to my mind is we're living through the late 1960s again. It feels like we're going through that period of time again. The history is repeating itself, the late 60s, the early 70s. What we're seeing now is the consequences of generations of the breakdown of education at all levels, the primary level, the secondary, post-secondary level. And of course, Ayn Rand had a lot to say about the student rebellions that were going on in the late 60s, late 70s. Perhaps we can also touch on that as well. But let's just begin. Can you say a little bit about what was it that grabbed you about these things that are going on in the news?
I feel it reminded me of these events that I heard used to take place in medieval villages, where entire villages would go insane for a period of time. And I got the sense that mass psychosis would happen because they had no clear sense of no capacity to identify reality. They were so immersed in religious experience that they were beholden to those feelings, and they were quite suggestible. And I feel like we're going through a very similar sort of cognitive breakdown today. It's been happening for decades, but now we're at the place where children don't respect reason anymore. They don't think reason is a tool of cognition. They think their emotions are. They are not being held accountable for whatever they do. In fact, in the case of Chicago, the mayor-elect suggested that the reason these kids were rioting, committing these violent acts towards other people, was because they needed stuff. They were poor, they were frustrated, they were hungry. Of course, many of those people in the videos that you see of the rampaging youths probably had shoes on that were more expensive than everything that I'm wearing right now. But that's the material. I think his justification, his altruistic justification that need justified their violence, was very telling. So I think on the one hand, we have people who are being robbed of the capacity to live in reality appropriately. I think that is the source of their frustration and rage, and people justifying it based on altruistic premises, which I think falls right into our wheelhouse with respect to being able to critique what's going on in a far more, I think, profound way than anyone on the right would.
Well, I don't see any really solid commentary from any of the news sources that I've looked into, whether it's on the left or on the right. They're simply at a loss to make a sense of why young people would be behaving this way. Certainly the fact that these young people aren't encountering any really confident opposition from their elders, from politicians. You mentioned the Chicago mayor-elect who took a very soft approach to the rioters, saying, well, these young people, they're deprived of stuff. I also heard a comment from, I think it was either a senator or a congressman of Illinois, who said, well, these young people are taking a stance against poverty and racism. So you have these adults who ought to know better, far from condemning the actions of these young people who are out destroying property, assaulting people, assaulting tourists. Instead, you find all these adults and politicians making excuses for them.
Yeah, that's terrifying. And I've noticed this trend in other respects too, where adults, and particularly adults in the political class, are giving children a political voice, as if they have the context to be able to state a rational context sweeping opinion about a political situation like that. That there's a big internet Twitter activist by the name of David Hogg, who was one of the victims of the Parkland shooting in Florida, who has parlayed that into a Harvard education and a massive internet following. But he knows, or at least at the time he started being an activist, knew absolutely nothing about the Second Amendment. But he was one of the first people that they used as the poster boy for gun violence whenever they wanted to pass gun laws. And of course, what's her face, Greta Thunberg is another example. A kid who's been indoctrinated by environmentalists in academia, in the education world, who knows probably nothing about science and scientific principles or climatology or physics, but is taken seriously enough to speak before the United Nations. I mean, I know there was a philosopher way back in the Enlightenment. Wasn't Rousseau the one who thought that youth was sort of a pure state, that children quite possibly knew more than adults, and they became corrupted by society? I feel like we're going back to some of these old pre-rational perspective. What do you think about that?
Well, with some of the young people who are acting up, for example, some of these protesters who've been defacing valuable works of art by throwing paint or soup, we know something about their intentions. Or there was that young woman who appeared naked on stage during some music awards show, and they actually proclaimed their intentions, that they're protesting against climate change, or the inaction of the political class against climate change. With these teen takeovers that we've seen in the past couple of weekends, nothing, no manifestos, no public declarations. All of the interpretations that we're getting from the politicians that we've mentioned, where are they coming from? How did this, particular senator or congressman come to the conclusion, well, these young people are protesting against poverty, they're protesting against injustice? It seems to me like these are just young people who are getting together to trash stores, trash cars, but there doesn't seem to be any political motivation behind it that we can ascertain.
There isn't, but you get the sense that it could be the political class is using this cynically as a way of advancing their narrative. But I also get the sense that in some respects they think the youth is purer, ideologically purer, more connected to the truth than us poor civilized folks who would prefer to live in peace. And so that there's a part of them that allows them to continue doing what they're doing because it's a pure expression of a feeling. And do you get the sense at all that any of this is the result of our cognitive decline over the last few decades? I don't think education has been focused on turning out rational, independent individuals. They're more focused on turning out cogs in a machine, in a political activist machine. What do you think?
Well, I think so. So a very good book that I read quite recently is Stephen Hicks's book on explaining postmodernism. Have you read it?
I haven't. I've listened to a couple of his lectures on it, though.
Yeah, he has some good lectures on YouTube. And one of the points he makes is that the failure of epistemology made postmodernism possible. The failure of epistemology, beginning with Kant, beginning with Hegel, well, actually beginning even with Hume and then escalating through Kant and Hegel and Schopenhauer, and which of course was then enthusiastically taken up by some American intellectuals, by Dewey, William James, and so on. So we've had generations of young people educated to believe that there are no principles, that you just have to act and see what the consequences of your action are, that abstractions have no connections with concrete reality. And the people who were protesters in the 60s and 70s, they are now in control of the educational institutions. They're now in control of the universities, and so on. And so now the young people that are being educated today are being educated by people who were influenced in the 60s and 70s by the Marcuse and the Frankfurt School. So all these bad ideas have been percolating through the culture for a very, very long time.
And now they're bearing fruit again. And so it's no mistake that those ideas which were finding purchase in the youth culture in the late 60s are now and have now been, I guess, metastasizing in academia for decades and decades and decades, and are now passing on to the next generations, the millennials and the Gen Zers. Those folks are now steeped in that. In those ideas of intolerance and activism and critical thinking, where they attempt to, I guess, tear down and deconstruct the ideas that our civilization is based on. I can't imagine that. I can't imagine that lending itself to a psychologically healthy kid if they're told that where they live is one of the worst places in the world, governed by the worst ideas in the world, dominated by power hierarchies that they have no capacity to fight against except through violence. So they're just acting out what they're learning, it seems.
When you consider just how poisonous the educational landscape is, I'm surprised that we don't see more teen violence and riots and takeovers. Of course, not all young people are like this. I know a lot of young people, whether it's my own nephews or young people I know through musical groups that I work with, who are, very polite, well-behaved, well-educated. They do well in school. They have, very impressive work ambitions. They're already earning money on their own. So what is the difference between a young person who manages to overcome all the cancerous ideas in our primary and secondary education and the young people that we've been seeing in the news in the past couple of weeks?
I mean, I would be, that's a great question. And you might know, do they have a nuclear family? Do they have a mother and a father that are still present, or at least engaged?
Yes,
Okay. I think that's a huge thing. It's an issue that Daniel Patrick Moynihan, I think, first brought up in the late 60s, where he noticed that the disintegration of the family was correlated to high criminal activity and a seriously degraded sense of self that wound up, producing very violent people. I get the sense that the right sort of adopted that study that he made on the welfare state and its hazards. But the left sort of ignores it. But I would hazard a guess that a lot of the kids in these violent groups probably only have one parent at home, or if they have two, the parents aren't very engaged because look, they're out there in the middle of the night rampaging through the streets. Where are the parents?
And it's interesting, one particular reaction that's come, I would say, from the political or ideological right. One article I read, apparently there was some pastors in Chicago marching through the streets with signs, addressed to the young people, with signs saying, "You matter to God." The idea being, well, what these young people are missing is faith. They're missing religion. Yeah, that's exactly what they need, is another form of irrationalism to corrupt their minds.
Yeah, it seems like the right is the only group complaining about these mass Lord of the Flies breakouts in their cities, and the only answer they have to this is a critique of the folks who aren't critiquing the actions of these kids, and religion. We've lost religion, and when you lose religion, you have no moral compass. Well, we know as objectivists that's not true. So, I mean, the question remains: what can we do about this? What can we as objectivists do to contribute to a healthier psychology in our society? What can we do to immediately solve the problem of these sort of mass insane gatherings and mass violence? What from your perspective, how can we start mending this road and putting us on a better path?
There are short-term as well as long-term solutions to the problem. Ultimately, the solution is going to have to come from academia. It's going to have to come from the universities. That's where the really bad, the really poisonous ideas are being generated. And of course, we have a lot of objectivists doing excellent work in Montessori education, primary and secondary education. That's all tremendously valuable. But we have to remember that most teachers in North America are being trained in the colleges, the teachers' colleges, and that's where they're getting indoctrinated with all of these very, very bad ideas about wokeness, anti-racism, white fragility, etc.
And there's no political will really to change that, to stop subsidizing colleges at the federal level, to pull the government out of education entirely. I think Reagan sort of had that notion in the 80s, and then like pretty much every other thing he wanted to do ended up not doing anything about it. But once you stop subsidizing these toxic ideas and allow education to become a competitive enterprise like anything else, I think these ideas will die rather quickly. As anything that's impractical, unethical, untrue will have to eventually stand up to reality. And I think reality in this case would be the market and the standard of the market, and how many people would actually allow their children to be subjected to this if they didn't have to because of compulsory education. But there is no political will to change that. So objectivists might be able to change the tide in 200 or 300 years, going at the very small incremental steps that we're taking in the way in which we're infiltrating academia. I mean, I tend to think that a rational person has a great deal more impact than an irrational one, but still, to change the educational establishment, it could be done in one fell swoop by a few politicians who are well placed and have the power. But I think as a grassroots movement, it would be an impossible thing to do over a long term, even within our lifetime. But what are some short-term things you think can happen? We know that academia has to change its tune, but what can we do as citizens and/or as people who occupy seats in local governments? What should we do to stop this stuff?
Well, first of all, the reason we have government is so that we can delegate the retaliatory use of force to some body governed by objective laws. Now, what do? Suppose you own a business in downtown Chicago, or suppose you live near downtown Chicago, and you have these teens rampaging through the streets, destroying cars, destroying property, looting stores. What are you going to do? What are you going to do when the police are unwilling or unable, because they're being hamstrung by lack of funding, bad law, bad legislation? So you did a discussion a couple of weeks ago about gun control legislation. It seems to me that what's happening now in Chicago and elsewhere, it seems to be the best argument against gun control legislation, that when the system is unable to protect individuals, the only alternative seems to be that individuals have to be able somehow to protect themselves. If I was working or living in downtown Chicago, I probably wouldn't go anywhere, at least without carrying pepper spray on me, or at least maybe some small handgun or something like that. And if I was living in these areas affected by this, I'd probably get together with neighbors, start a neighborhood watch, make sure that most people at least have a shotgun or something at home so they can protect themselves in case of emergency. I mean, what we're seeing is virtually a descent into anarchy, where people have to start thinking about protecting themselves somehow. Do you agree or disagree?
I do, and I think that's scary, and it almost seems deliberate. I don't want to say that it is. I don't want to align myself in any way with conspiracy theorists, but when you disarm a population of innocent people while at the same time not maintaining law and order. I mean, all right, if we're delegating force completely to the police force, and you're going to disarm us so we can't effectively defend ourselves, and the police have to stand in the gap for us. And if they're not going to, you're going to give us no alternative but to form a private police organization or neighborhood watch organization, or something like the Guardian Angels, who were considered vigilantes at the time, who went around and patrolled the subways in the 70s and 80s because nobody was taking care of crime. Nobody was looking out for people, and the innocent people in the subways. So yeah, I mean, there's no political will in the world of the left where they fund the police, where they educate the police to handle one-on-one confrontations physically without using deadly force. There's no will for them to put more cops on the street and to enforce the law so that these people, when they break it, they feel the repercussions of the community come down on them hard. So you can't break windows at a Gucci store and get away with it because it's a Gucci store. Your ass is gonna go to jail, and you're gonna spend time, one would hope, repaying that debt to society, not just in jail time, but in work. Involuntary servitude. Yes, I said it. Those kids need to learn that when they commit a crime, it does not pay. It's going to pay the person that you owe restitution to. And your time is going to be committed to paying that back. I bet if they do that to a few people, those kids will be less inclined to go out there and break the law. So yeah, we need more police. We need people to prosecute people violating the law hard, prosecute them hard. And of course, we need an education system that is going to teach young people to think, not follow their emotions as primaries, as Ayn Rand would say. We have a few super chats here. Bonnie Bertrand for $1.49. Thank you, Bonnie, for your support. Ashley Shrugged for $4.99. Thanks, Ashley. Schools have produced ignorant, entitled little collectivists with no real values who face zero consequences. Internet simplifies organization of events. That's true. These events have been organized on the internet. Now, if they could use the internet to trace organizing the riot at the Capitol on January 6th, why can't they do the same for these and hold the people who are organizing the events accountable or ban them from social media permanently for doing this? I mean, I think that's one way in which private enterprise can contribute to law enforcement to some degree. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, absolutely. And notice the double standard in terms of the reaction to the January 6th riots on the one hand, and the riots in Chicago on the one hand. With the January 6th riot, because of the connection with Trump and the Republicans, there was a lot of political machinery in terms of getting these people arrested and getting justice. But by contrast, when there's private businesses being destroyed or private property being destroyed, there isn't the political will to punish the people behind it.
It's just property. You know, they've made that distinction before. Yeah. It's just property. It can be replaced. Yeah, there seems to be no connection in the minds of these rioters between property and life. And that's scary. I remember having a discussion with somebody from the human rights, it's HRC, I don't remember what the C stands for, but they were a LGBTQ activist group, and I supported them when they were, supporting legislation for gay marriage. But then they were pushing all kinds of other agendas that were violations of people's property. And when they would try to sell me on this, they'd call me and try to sell me on the latest piece of legislation they wanted to club somebody with. And I would sort of corner the salesperson and talk to them about property rights, and they could not make the integration of property rights and rights. They thought they were completely separate issues, which they are not. You're busting somebody's window. You are stealing a certain amount of time from their life, because now they have to divert resources that they acquired by work and thought and devoted time which they can't get back, to something they wouldn't have had to if you hadn't broken their window. You're now putting them in a position that they wouldn't have been in before. And their life is altered and changed to some degree, to the degree that you destroy their property. If you completely annihilate it, then their living is done. I think kids need to see that property and life are intimately interconnected, and you can't break somebody's stuff and not affect their life in some way. We have another one with Mary Aline, $4.99. Are kids being taught to think? I don't think they are. I think they're being taught to feel, and whatever their feelings are is what matters. And I think the adults are playing to the kids' emotions, as opposed to behaving like the standard for the kids, where they can correct their feelings and help them navigate those emotions a lot better by providing a more rational contextual standard for them. Do you agree? Or
or as Rucka would say, there are no adults in the room because the adults are as emotionalist and whim worshipping as the young people that they're supposed to be educating.
Isn't that crazy? But don't you think some of that as well is because they're influenced by that Rousseauian child innocence? The child is elevated above civilization sort of notion.
Well, yeah, the child is elevated above the civilization, and natives are elevated above European civilization and the Enlightenment. It's all connected. It all goes back to Rousseau and the noble savage and the idea that civilization, industry, commerce corrupts human nature.
Yeah. So going back to Rand again, she was right. You may not think you have a philosophy, but you do. And if all you have to do is tell someone your premises, and they should be able to point out which philosophy you've unconsciously adopted. Jonathan Honig with $3.99. Thank you, Jonathan, always for your support. And as a participant in the show, it's always great to have you around. Kiana Pellegrino with $5. Make a mentorship program to help young adults. That would help. Hi, Dad. What's up, Kiana? Yeah, a mentorship program would be great. I mean, they used to have that Big Brother program. Whatever happened to that, you know?
I think it still exists. Certainly, Big Brother still exists in Canada. I don't know about the United States.
Yeah, I mean, but it used to.
I don't hear too much about them.
Yeah, I don't either. It used to be quite a thing in the 70s and early 80s, and now it's sort of dropped off the radar. But if parents aren't going to become the mentors of a child's life, if they're just going to let the child run wild, then certainly a mentor program, I think, would be a great substitute. I know that I didn't really have parental guidance growing up, and I actively sought mentors in my life. So I didn't, I actually sought teachers in various realms, not just in academia, to help me navigate the world. So in some respects, I was fortunate to have that, I guess, instinct to find somebody to help me. And others don't necessarily have that in them, but I think a mentor program would be great. And maybe that would be part of a sentencing. If somebody goes to jail or goes on a work program to pay back someone for the damages that they've created, maybe as a part of their parole, they become instituted in this mentor system where they get taught actual values, how to think, how to be self-sufficient, and to stop acting out on their negative feelings.
Absolutely. I'm sure that out of these young people who are rioting and looting, there must be some who are still redeemable, who have some core of basic decency, that if they're exposed to the right kind of ideas, they might be able to turn their lives around.
Well, we have a long road ahead of us as objectivists. We are against that kind of culture, but more importantly, we're for reason. So it's one thing to be against this kind of irrationality and violence. It's another thing to offer a great alternative, which is reason, productivity, honesty, integrity, independence, self-esteem. These are virtues, folks, of the objectivist world. And I don't think you can be the kind of person that would tolerate violent crowds like this if you were living by those virtues. So hopefully we're getting the word out enough, and hopefully it'll saturate some of the young community. Kiana's young still, so, and I feel like these ideas are filtering into her. Good work, Kiana. Well, I mean, I think we've plumbed the depths here. Do you have any final comments with respect to this terrible series of events?
Just one for people who want a little more context, philosophic context about what is wrong with young people today. There are two excellent essays by Rand that I would recommend. One is Apollo and Dionysus, and the other is The Cashing In the Student Rebellion. I believe those essays were reprinted in The New Left, the Anti-Industrial Revolution, or the updated version, which is The Return of the Primitive, edited by Peter Schwartz. So those are two really excellent essays showing the connection between philosophical deterioration, the problems of education at the college university level, and how that can affect the philosophical premises and psychologies of young people. So check out those two essays.
And really quickly, one thing I remember from one of those two essays that particularly struck me was how Rand referred to the hippie generation as conformists. Yeah. Because popular culture considered them to be nonconformists. But when you read these essays, you'll see how they are simply adopting the ethics of their parents more purely. They're
and their professors.
And they're professors. They're just adopting what they've been taught more purely. They're not rebelling against anything, which I thought was a completely unique perspective and still remains so today. And if you read those two essays, guys, I think you will really get insights into what's happening today. It's amazing how timely those essays are right now, 50, 60 years after they were written. She was truly prescient. Well, thank you, Nicholas, for spending your afternoon here with me, and I hope to do it again in the future. Folks, this has been The Daily Objective, brought to you by the Ayn Rand Center UK, and we'll see you tomorrow. In the meantime, always remember to check your premises. Peace.